Welcome to this presentation in which we're going to discuss method 1 for identifying passive voice. There are 3 methods that we can use for identifying passive voice, and we'll cover all 3 of the methods in this class. I like to start with what I call method 1, or the verb method, because I have found that most students find it the easiest method to identify passive voice. And so students, I recommend start with this method. But it's a good idea to have at least 2 of the 3 methods firmly in your grasp, because even though all 3 methods work on every single sentence, there are some sentences in which method 1 will be easier, some sentences where method 2 will be easier, some sentences where method 3 will be easier. So the more methods that you've mastered, the more likely it will be that you will be successful at identifying passive voice. Okay, so let's get started on method 1. Actually, method 1, I'm going to say, is actually 2 methods. I'm going to cover the easier way first, and then I'm going to cover a second way which might apply to certain students, okay? So the first method when you're identifying passive voice is to identify the complete verbal phrase in a sentence. Let's talk about what a verbal phrase is. Basically, a verbal phrase is just all of the words in the sentence that are verbs. And it can be several in a sentence, or it can just be one. I'm going to call it a verbal phrase even if it's just one word. So let me just give you an example of a verbal phrase that is one word. Mary ate the sandwich. There's only one word in a sentence that is a verb. And so I can say that my verbal phrase is one word long, and it's just the word ate. The way that I identify a verbal phrase is I find what I call the anchor verb, which is the verb that describes what's happening. What's the event? If I get a mental picture going on, what's happening in the story, that's the word that tells me what it is. And so in this case, I look at the word ate and I say, okay, that's a verb. I'm sure that's a verb. It looks like the anchor verb. So I'm going to go to the left and look at the next word. And I'm going to decide, well, is that a verb? Well, Mary is a noun. It's a proper noun. I know it's not a verb, so it can't be part of the verbal phrase. Now, let's say I'm not sure if ate was my anchor verb. Maybe I'm confused and thinking maybe there's a verb after it. And this isn't the anchor verb. This is an auxiliary verb. After all, it's short. And we think about auxiliary verbs as being short. So let's look to the right. Well, we have the word the. Okay, well, the is usually considered an adjective. Some people call it a noun marker. But the one thing we know it's not is it's not a verb. So when we have a verb surrounded by nouns and adjectives, we know that this is the total length of the verbal phrase. So we can say with confidence, our complete verbal phrase is just the word ate in this particular sentence. It's pretty common in English to have verbal phrases of one word, but probably more common it is to have sentences of more than one verb. So let's look at some of those. So in our next sentence, as I read this sentence, Mary has been eating a hamburger. The word that most strongly suggests to me what's happening in the sentence is the word eating. So that seems likely to be my anchor verb. So I'm going to go to the left and look at each one of the words to the left. Typically, the words before our anchor verb are oftentimes going to be auxiliary verbs. Let's look at those auxiliary verbs for a second. Some of y'all may have memorized them as children. I learned a 23-word song because 23 are most people consider there to be in English 23 auxiliary verbs. You may have learned it. If you did, thank that English teacher or your mom, because you're going to be able to sing that song in your head. I'd sing it right now, but I embarrass myself. If you didn't memorize it, that's also okay, because guess what? You can print this up and keep it handy and have this list to refer to on a regular basis. As you look at this list, you will probably notice a couple things about it. The first thing you may notice is that many of the words are short. Another thing you may notice is that the words have a verb-y feel about them. They suggest kind of either it happened at a particular time, and of course the way we communicate the passage of time in English is through verbs, past tense, present tense, future tense. or it has some idea that makes you think of it as a verb. The third thing that is pretty common about these words is that this is the total list of them. There's not 50 or 100 to go through. There are a few that we could add to this list, so it's a very manageable number. And when you work with them, you're going to see pretty quickly that they have a feel that's similar. But again, you don't ever have to memorize them. You can just print up a sheet and carry it around with you when you're doing legal writing, and you're covered. So we're going to look at this list for a second. Now we're going to go back to our previous list. And we're looking for the word been. We're going to see if been is on the list of an auxiliary verb. By the way, here is the website for this list that I came across. You might want to use it if you want to print this up. So I'm looking for been. Here's been right here. B-E-E-N. So I can see it's an auxiliary verb. So it should be part of my verbal phrase. So I'm going to put been in yellow because it's part of the verbal phrase. I'm going to keep on going to the left. And I have the word has. Well, let's see if that's on the list. It sure is, H-A-S. So I can add that. Then we keep on going to the left. I don't have to check this one though. I'm sure Mary is not on the list. It's a proper noun, and nouns can't be auxiliary verbs. Now let's say though I'm not sure about eating. I'm not sure if that's the last verb in my verbal phrase or not. Maybe it's an auxiliary verb too, and I'm just mistaken. Well, so I can always look to the right just to make sure I captured the entire verb. In this case, we have a noun marker, so it's called an adjective, but the one thing you can't call it is a verb. So yes, we have our complete verbal phrase here. I'm going to underline it. So we captured underline our one-word verbal phrase. So hopefully that's pretty intuitive. If you've got the auxiliary or helping verb list, this should be a piece of cake. Let's look at our next sentence. Susan will have graduated from college by 2025. As I'm reading this, the word that feels most communicating the action of the sentence is the word graduated. So I'm going to put that in yellow. That's probably going to be my anchor verb. So I'm going to mainly think about going to the left. So let's see if have is one of our auxiliary verbs. Yes, it is. H-A-V-E. So I can go ahead and put that in yellow. I'm going to go one more. I'm going to look at will. Let's see if will is on my list. And yep, it sure is. W-I-L-L. So I know that that is going to be part of my verbal phrase. Susan, of course, is a proper noun, so it's not a verb. In case I'm thinking graduated may not be my anchor word, I'm going to look to the right just to make sure. Well, from, I can check on my list here, but from is not on this list. From is actually a preposition. And so prepositions can't be verbs, so I know my entire verbal phrase is will have graduated. Let's look at our next sentence. Ted has not been avidly golfing since his car accident. Okay. So it seems to be that golfing is our major word. It's going to be our anchor verb in this sentence. It tells us what the action of the sentence is. So let's go to our left. We have the word avidly. I could check to see if it's an auxiliary verb, but I'm pretty sure it's not. You see these are arranged alphabetically, and there's no avidly here. So your first thought might be, well, okay, then this is our complete verbal phrase. Well, not quite. There is one exception. I said the verbal phrase includes verbs, but it also, the verbal phrase can have in the middle of it, kind of like a donut hole, it can have adverbs. So if you have a verbal phrase, in the middle of the verbal phrase, you may find adverbs. Some people consider the adverbs part of the verbal phrase, but most people probably think of the adverbs as being interruptions of that longer verbal phrase. So this is an adverb. How do I know this is an adverb? Well, the biggest clue here is the addition of this ly. Ly in English, that suffix almost always means in English that it's an adverb. So if you see that, you can pretty much safely say, okay, that's an adverb. So I can see that this word is definitely an adverb. Of course, if I'm unsure, I can always Google it. Let me just go ahead and Google avidly part of speech. And I will look at this, and it tells me it's an adverb. But again, I didn't really have to do that because it ended ly. So I know that it's possible that there's going to be a part of my verbal phrase on the other side of avidly. Won't always be the case that there will be, but there's a possibility that it will be. So my next word is the word been. We've already looked and seen that been is on our list. It's wrong list. There we go. Been is an auxiliary verb. So we're going to add been as part of our verbal phrase. Our next word is not. Well, not isn't on our auxiliary list. You can see need to, ought to, and it doesn't end ly. So you might be thinking, oh, well, I guess our verbal phrase is over here. But no, not is an irregular adverb. Let's look at a list of regular and irregular adverbs. You may want to note the location of this. This is a good list. You'll see the vast majority of these adverbs. This is not a list of every adverb on the planet, by the way, but this you'll see that the vast majority of these adverbs do end ly, but there are some that are irregular. Afterwards, almost, always. Far, fast, even, less, more, and for us, not. Not is an adverb. So even though it doesn't end ly, it works the same way as all of our other adverbs. So we're going to put not in green. Especially for the irregular adverbs, I think it's a good idea to have this list or a similar list handy. If you don't want to print out this whole list, you might just go through here and identify the ones, because obviously there's another one that's common, very. Obviously, the ones that end in ly, you probably don't need to print out, but come up with a list of ones that don't end in ly, but are common adverbs. So you'll have that list handy. And my guess is you can put down the same piece of paper that you have this and just have the one sheet of paper, or maybe index card that you carry around with you. Okay. So we have not. Now we're going to keep on going to the left. We have the word has. Well, we can see up here that has is in fact an auxiliary verb. So I'm not going to look it up one more time. And we end with ted. Ted's obviously a proper noun. So we know there's no, that's not a verb. And so our search has stopped because it stops whenever we hit something that is neither a verb nor an adverb. Just in the event that we were wrong about golfing being our anchor word, we're going to go to the right and check. Well, since can play a couple of different roles in an English sentence, but we know it can't be a verb. So we have our verbal phrase here, has been golfing. Let's look at our last sentence. Bob was tall, so he wore a large size of pants. Okay, so I'm going to look, and I'm guessing the major verb here is probably the word were, right? Wore, sorry about that. I'm going to put that in yellow. And I'm going to look to the left, and I have the word he. He is a pronoun. It's neither an adverb or a verb, so I know that we're done that direction. Then I'm going to go to the right to make sure I captured everything. We have a noun marker, which can't be an adverb, can't be a verb. So our entire verbal phrase is the word wore. But as I read this sentence, I notice something else that I have. What does that look? That looks like one of those auxiliary verbs we were looking at before. Let me go ahead and pull up that list so we can confirm. Yes, was right here. Okay. So it looks like, let me just go ahead and highlight here. It looks like that this sentence actually has two verbal phrases. And in fact, sentences can have many more than two verbal phrases. So that's not at all an unusual thing. Let's look in more detail about this first verbal phrase. We have the word was. We know that was can be the anchor word, but it can also be one of those auxiliary verbs. So when we see was, it may be that there are verbs to the left of it and verbs to the right of it. So we're going to have to analyze both directions. So let's look at our verb, our word to the left, and that is Bob. Again, a proper noun. We know that can't be an adverb or a verb. So let's look to our right. We have the word tall. Tall is an adjective. The word tally could be an adverb, but this is an adjective, and an adjective can't interrupt a verbal phrase. So we know that was is the complete length of that verbal phrase. So we have two verbal phrases here, was and wore. Now, again, you might have some temptation to think, well, maybe was and wore are part of the same verbal phrase. Well, we know that the three words in between would all have to be either verbs or adverbs. And we can look at these and tell that actually none of these are verbs or adverbs. This is an adjective, this is a conjunction, and this is a pronoun. So we know it just can't be the case that these are part of the same verbal phrase. So now once we've identified the verbal phrase, then we're ready to identify passive voice. So how do we go about doing that? Well, let's see here. The thing, typically the anchor word, the last word in the verbal phrase is what we're going to focus on first. And we're going to see, does it end with ed, en, or t? Those will be hints that that particular word might be a past participle. So let's look at our list. We have ate, eating, graduated, golfing, was, and wore. The only one that follows that pattern is graduated. So if I looked at this, I would be thinking to myself, well, maybe this is in passive voice because it's got one of the components to it. So then I need to look at this sentence and apply the second test, which is I have to see if there's a to be verb in the verbal phrase. And we know that our to be verbs are also auxiliary verbs, so they'll be on this list here. But there's just 8 of them. And again, if you haven't committed those to memory, go ahead and do so. You can print up this list and just circle the ones that are to be verbs. Am, are, is, was, were, been, being, and they do not have be, but you could put actually they do have be up here, don't they? So all of them are on this list. They're a special case of an auxiliary verb. Now you need to have that. That's one of the 2 ingredients. To have passive voice, you must have a past participle and you must have a to be verb in the same verbal phrase. So let's look at our sentence 3. Susan will have graduated from college by 2025. Have is not a to be verb. Will is not a to be verb. Let's again look at our list. How do we know? Well, these are our 8 words. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. Sometimes people think, well, how about these other little words? Do, does, did, have, has, had. In other words, all the other auxiliary verbs on this list. They kind of feel like they're in the same category as a to be verb. Well, you're right. They're all auxiliary or helping verbs, but they don't come from that same to be verb family. The way that I remember, in addition to just memorizing the 8 words, is I remember this little mnemonic, WABI. All of the to be verbs start with either a W, an A, a B, or an I. A for am, I for is, W for was, B for being. Those are I for is. So that covers them all. But you can see the auxiliary verbs, they don't start with a W, an I, a W, an A, B, or an I. Let's go look at this longer list. You can see there are the will and the would, so those could be confused for under the Wabi standard. But you can see under the A's, there's no competition. These are both to be verbs. Under the I, there's no competition. Is a to be verb. And we can see under B, there is no competition. It's just be, being, and been. So the only place where this rule gets a little bit confusing would be with the will and would. We're really focusing on the was and the were. So Wabi can be a good way of remembering that these words are not to be verbs. Okay, so we've reached the conclusion that even though Susan has something that looks like a past participle, and it is a past participle, by the way, it's missing the other necessary ingredient, the to be verb. So we know that this sentence is active voice. And we know that, in fact, all these sentences are an active voice because none of them are include a past participle other than the Susan sentence, and the Susan sentence was lacking the to be verb. So that to me is the best and the easiest way to use method 1. But before we complete with this method, I'm going to show you one more thing. So I have on this list a variety of endings that apply to past participles. The most common endings by far are ed and en. I'd say at least 80% of past participles end with either ed or en. But there's a fair number of irregular ones, unfortunately. So I'm going to show you a list of those. You may want to jot down this website. And you can see the past participles here. Some of them end en, like bitten or broken. Some of them end with a T, like brought or caught. But some don't follow that rule at all, like born, become, begun. So it could be helpful for you to have this list handy. Maybe ones that seem especially tricky for you. You can probably remember the ENs, okay, and maybe even the T's, okay, but you might be thrown by become. So that might be something you add to your list. Or you might have an issue with lane, for example. Of course, you can always Google these. So let's say that I'm not sure what part of speech lane is. I might say lane part of speech into Google. Here we can see the part of speech. I'm going to tell it to you quickly. I'm actually going to go to, I'm in Yahoo. I'm going to go to Google. I find Google is more reliable when it comes to things like this. So I'm going to do Google.com and now we went to maps. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to type in lane part of speech. And you can see that it's telling us it's a past participle right here. I wanted to graduated. It can tell me that it's part of the verb. Let's see if it's going to be more granular here. Why don't we ask this question? So let me go back. Is we can say lane past participle. Here we get. Well, lane is the past participle. Let's see about graduated. And we can see here they have a little table that says past participle graduated. So you can always Google to see what the past participle for a particular word is. But you probably aren't going to need to do that most of the time, because if it ends en or ed, it's a pretty safe bet. It's a past participle if, there is a to be verb in that verbal phrase. Okay, so once you found your two ingredients, you can say it's definitely passive voice. But what if I only have one of the ingredients? I only have past participle, I only have a to be verb in my verbal phrase. Then it's definitely active voice. You have to have both ingredients. One of the ingredients is not enough. Now, we will learn in a later lecture about something I call the informal passive voice. That's a different thing. It's not a good thing. I don't want you to do that, but it is not technically passive voice. So just because it doesn't have both of these ingredients doesn't mean you don't need to revise it, doesn't mean it's well written, but it does mean you have managed to avoid having passive voice in your sentence. Okay, so we've talked about how to approach identifying passive voice when we can identify the verbal phrase. Please work on that. If you're not so strong with identifying the verbal phrase, work on that till you get confident in that area. But in the meantime, I still want you to be able to identify passive voice. So let's talk about a workaround. And this is the workaround that I recommend while you're still perfecting your technique there. I recommend you go directly to number 4 and look for these 8 words. If you find them, you know you're good. You found at least a to be verb. And so once you find your verb, let's just pick a sentence here. Let's just use this sentence. Bob was eaten by the tiger. If I'm reading this sentence, I immediately see that was is a to be verb. And I can go through my document and just note these words as I'm reading along, okay? Then when I go back through my second pass, I'm going to look for past participles. And let's see. Here. And I'm going to look at the 4 words after my to be verb. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to say there's never a time where it could be the 5th word, but just to make it easy, I like to do 4 because it would be unusual for it to be more than 4 away and still part of the same verbal phrase. So I'm going to look to the right and I'm going to look at eaten. Well, the first thing I notice is that it ends en, and that's one of my combination that I have been alerted to commonly can be a past participle. So I'm just going to see if that is one. Eaten past participle. Yes, eat is the present simple, ate is the past simple, eaten is the past participle. So I do know that is a past participle, so I can also highlight that. So I'm done. In this way, I don't have to necessarily identify the whole verbal phrase. I have been able to see that these two are there's no nouns or verbs between them. And I have my 2 ingredients that I need for passive voice, a to be verb and a past participle. So I know that this sentence is passive voice. I don't need to do anything else. I'm going to add the word slowly here. Let's imagine that this was our sentence again. So I'm going to get rid of this. Let's say we're working on this sentence from the very beginning. Okay, so I have found this word was, and I'm going to look 4 words to the right. So I've highlighted them. Slowly is word 1, eaten is word 2, by is word 3, the is word 4. So I'm going to look at this first one, slowly. Well, the first thing I notice is it ends ly. I know that words that end ly are adverbs, and so I'm going to put that in green. That doesn't count as a past participle, obviously, but because we can have adverbs in the middle of our verbal phrase, we keep on going. So our next word again is eaten. Again, we do that check to make sure, yes, it really is a past participle. And now we know, yes, because we know that was and eaten are part of the same verbal phrase because the only thing that interrupts them is an adverb, and adverbs are allowed to interrupt verbal phrases. So again, we know this sentence is still passive voice. Let's look at this sentence over here. Get rid of the highlights and work on a blank slate. Let's look at the first sentence. Mary is tall and walked to school. Not the best sentence ever, but it's grammatically okay. So I'm doing my analysis of, I'm going to use my second method, the method that I would use if I'm not confident about identifying verbal phrases. So the to be verb I identify in this sentence is the word is. So I find that. I look through the rest of the sentence. There are no more to be verbs. So now I'm going to pick the four words after that. I'm going to highlight them just so that we could see them clearly, because tall is 1, and is 2, walked is 3, to is 4. So I look at tall. Well, the word tall is an adjective. I can Google that. Just to confirm if I'm not sure. Tall, part of speech. Tall is an adjective. Well, adjectives cannot interrupt verbal phrases. So I don't need to look any farther, because this is a no-go at this point. We can't have, if we do have more verbal stuff after tall, it's got to be a different verbal phrase. So this verbal phrase, Mary is tall, isn't passive voice. It has the to be verb, but it doesn't have a past participle. So we know that this one is not in passive voice. Let's read the rest of the sentence. Mary is tall and walked to school. Well, we don't have any more to be verbs in the sentence, so we know that this sentence has to be active voice. But we might be thinking to ourselves, well, there is another verb, right? When we have the word walked, right? Well, we do. That is a verb, so we have a second verbal phrase. And if we were, again, using method 1, when we look for the complete verbal phrase, we could do that analysis of looking before and looking after. But we really don't need to in this case, because we know for sure there is no to be verb in the neighborhood. This is active voice, this first part, and the second part, the part with walked, is also active voice. But let's just do the analysis just so we can be confident. So we're going to look to the left of walked, and we have the word and. And is a conjunction. But let's say I'm not sure about that. So I'm going to say and part of speech. It's a conjunction. Okay, well, we know a conjunction is not the same thing as a verb or an adverb. So we know we don't need to look any farther this way. This is a hard stop with and. Let's look to the right just to make sure this is our anchor verb. We have the word to. Well, to is a preposition. But again, if I'm not sure, I can just type it into Google and it will tell me that, yeah, I put it in quotes. We'll see. Okay, it's not going to. Okay, so to, let's just do to definition. Okay, and it's telling us it's a preposition. It can be an adverb, but that's pretty rare. And in this case, it's not being used as an adverb. People don't think of it as an adverb. So we still have it be, and we can see even, so let's say we're not sure. We might, call this, we'll put it in pink because we're just not sure what it is. We can go to the next word. Well, school is definitely a noun. And so we're sure that walked is our entire verbal phrase. There's no to be verb. So we have active voice, and then we have active voice again. And I've broken up this sentence to see what it really means. This is a little bit of, I'm going to use the term shorthand. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly grammatically correct. But this is what this sentence means when we say, here is some of this highlighting so it's a little easier to see. Mary is tall and walked to school. What we're really saying is Mary is tall, period. Mary walked to school. So we're really having two ideas. And typically when you have two ideas, you're going to have two verbal phrases. So hopefully this is helpful. We're going to be talking about the other two methods. If you like this method, wonderful. Use it, practice it. If this method, for whatever reason, was confusing to you, no worries. We have 2 more coming up. So I hope this is helpful. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for your attention.